Welcome everyone to this webinar from Chatham House about Taiwan's elections. My name is Ben Bland and I'm the director of the Asia Pacific program here at Chatham House. There's now less than 3 days until polls open in Taiwan's presidential and legislative elections. And in this year when several billion people are going to the polls, I think it's fair to say that this is going to be one of the most consequential elections, not just for Taiwan, but for the US-China relationship and for stability and the future of democracy, I think, across the region. This is also, of course, a pivotal moment for Taiwan's 23 million people as well, 20 million of whom are going to be voting on Saturday. We do know that Taiwan will be getting a new leader because incumbent President Tsai Ing-wen from the Democratic Progressive Party is stepping down, having reached the 2-term limit in Taiwan. Her vice president, Lai Ching-te, has been the marginal frontrunner throughout most of the campaign, followed by Hou Yu-ih of the KMT, the Kuomintang and Ko Wen-je of the new Taiwan People's Party. Polls have also suggested that the DPP might lose its majority in the legislative yuan, as Taiwan's parliament is known. But because of legal restrictions in Taiwan, we won't be discussing the polling numbers in detail today. But I'm glad to say that I'm joined by 3 really insightful speakers to try and make sense of what's happened during the election campaign and to get some sense of how the elections might affect the future trajectory of Taiwan and Taiwan's key relationships with the US and China. So Dr. Chunyi Li is director of the Taiwan Research Hub at the University of Nottingham. You can read about all her many accomplishments on her online biographies. Similarly, for Dr. Bo-jun Jing, who's a senior research fellow at the Taiwan Studies program at the University of Oxford. And last but not least, Dr. Michael Riley is a former British diplomat who served as the UK's representative in Taiwan and now sits on the advisory board of the Global Taiwan Institute in Washington, DC, as well as being a non-resident fellow as well at the University of Nottingham. So the way today is going to work, I'm going to ask questions to our panelists for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then I'm going to open up to questions from our audience today. Please use the Q&A box to ask your questions, and we will come to them in good time. And finally, a reminder to all our participants that this session is on the record and it is being recorded, and the recording will be posted online later. So first up, I'm going to come to you, Bo-jun, who's joining us today from Taipei, and ask you to briefly set the scene for a bit about the main candidates in the election and what they stand for. And I know you're going to share a few slides to kick us off. So thanks for that. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Ben, and thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me at this panel. Yeah, it's a very timely event. And as Ben said, I actually have some slides. It's kind of like how setting scene regarding the candidates profile. So let's do that right now. I hope it works. Okay, perfect. Okay, yeah. So this is this year we have the 3-way race. In Taiwanese, we call it Sakadu, means 3-way race. And we have a Taiwan People's Party, Ko Wen-je, DPP is William Lai and KMT Hou Yu-ih. And as you can see here, the first we talk about the Lai Xiao ticket or Meide ticket. So William Lai, as Ben mentioned, is a current vice president, and he has been the vice president since President Tsai Ing-wen's beginning of the 2nd term. He assumed the chairperson role of the DPP following the party's significant defeat to Kuomintang in the 2022 local elections. In his earlier political career, Lai served as the premier of the ROC and during Tsai's 1st term, and was the mayor of Tainan City from 2010 and 2017. Okay, so Lai's running mate, Xiao Meiqing, or Viking Xiao, also aka Cat Warrior, recently held the position of Taiwan's representative to the US, and known for her love for cats, and she humorously conveys her dedication to counter China's alleged aggressive warrior diplomacy through her distinctive approach of cat warrior diplomacy. And there's some speculation about the Lai Ching-te's pick is that Lai chose Xiao as his running mate to maintain robust ties and effective communication with the US. And the aim is to persuade the White House that that he is competent in preserving the status quo across the Taiwan Strait. Okay, Hou Yu-ih, well, he has been in the position of New Taipei City Mayor since 2018. Actually, at this point, he's still the mayor. And before that, he served as the deputy mayor of New Taipei for nearly 8 years when the current KMT chairman, Eric Chu-li-lun, held the mayoral office in the highly populated city in Taiwan. Prior to entering politics, Hou Yu-ih had a lengthy career in law enforcement, commencing as a criminal police officer in 1980 and steadily rising through the ranks to become the Director General of the National Police Agency in the late 2000s. And Hou's last-minute running mate, Zhao Zhaokang, is a well-known media personality. He's an experienced TV and radio host, so it's not surprising at all that he's quite articulate. He has served as the legislator twice and held the position of Minister of the Environmental Protection Administration from the late 1980s to the early 1990s. Okay, so Hou's selection of Zhao is arguably influenced by Zhao Zhaokang's so-called blue blood, signifying his descent from the mainlanders who migrated to Taiwan with Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government around 1949. This kind of complements Hou's local Taiwanese background and may help solidify support from deep blue voters. Okay, finally, Ko Wen-je, who served 2 terms as Taipei City Mayor from 2014 to 2022, went on to establish the TPP, Taiwan's People's Party, in August 2019 and has been its chairperson since. Prior to entering the Taipei political scene, Ko Wen-je gained prominence as a renowned surgeon at National Taiwan University Hospital and held a professorship in medicine at NTU, earning his nickname Ke Pi as Professor Ke. So he's a pick of Cynthia Wu Xingyi, a wealthy businesswoman and current legislator nominated by the TPP, is the daughter of a very wealthy Taiwanese financier associated with the Xinguang Group, Xinguang Jituan. And born and educated in the United States, she has become a noteworthy addition to Ko's political team. One prevalent theory regarding Ko's selection of Wu is that her wealthy background could potentially provide additional financial resources for this very young, only 4-year-old party to effectively compete on the campaign trail, which typically is very, very costly, as we all know. Right. So okay. So I'll just briefly say this is I summarized the main policy of the 3 candidates based on their performance on the policy presentation and as well as the presidential debate. And as you can see, actually, in response to Chinese pressure, all 3 candidates have emphasized the need to build up deterrence capabilities and express the willingness to engage in dialogue with Beijing. But while they all publicly support increasing the defense budget, their cross-strait policies differ. Following Tsai Ing-wen's approach, William Lai does not accept the 1992 consensus as the DPP opposes one China principle component. Hou Yu-ih supports the 1992 consensus in line with the ROC constitution, but rejects Beijing's one country, 2 system proposal. And Ko Wen-je has been ambiguous, but leans toward a critical stance on the definition of the 1992 consensus. Finally, my final point is that regarding their definition of cross-strait relations, Lai argued that the ROC and the PRC are not subordinate to one another. And Hou Yu-ih agrees with the concept of mutual non-recognition of sovereignty and mutual non-denial of governing authority. And Ko Wen-je simplifies it as a special relationship. So notably, none of them advocates for de jure independence or reunification, but they still face this crucial task of persuading Taiwanese voters, if not the reassuring Washington that each of their cross-strait stances is feasible and can maintain the peaceful status quo across the Taiwan Strait.
Great. That's a really comprehensive and very sort of swift look at the candidates. So thanks for that, Bojin. I mean, if I can just ask a follow-up question, I might come to Chun-Yi on this, but I mean, how significant are these differences between the candidates when it comes to cross-straits policy? Because it seems, you know, looking at it from the outside, they all say they want to boost Taiwan's defenses. They all say you need to talk to China somehow, if you can, and no one really has an answer for how. And they all say effectively they want Taiwan's 23 million people to decide Taiwan's future democratically. So Chun-Yi, maybe you could give us your view. I mean, do you think there are actually substantial differences between the candidates on cross-strait policy? Chun-Yi, I can't hear you right now. I'm not sure if there's a problem with the mic, but I might, while we sort that out, I might come to you, Bo-jun. Maybe you could give us, go a bit deeper there. So yeah, how significant are these differences really, Bo-jun? Can you tell us? And hopefully we can sort out Chun-Yi's mic in a sec. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah. Well, as you said, yeah, and also as I show in my last slide, it's very, when it comes to defense and having dialogue with China, they're the same. And this time it's a three-way race. But when you examine their policy toward US, toward China, and also maybe on Japan, it's quite friendly. It's like even KMT, I think it's kind of shifting toward like pro-US stance, and be friendly with Japan, and be peaceful, have a peaceful relationship with the mainland China. So I think, I mean, on that level, it's pretty similar. But just the nuance is that really, that's why I showed the slide, the table about their different views on 1992 consensus. I know it's we can spend an hour to talk about the history of it, but basically, yeah, KMT it's think that 1992 consensus is a key password for cross-strait dialogue, and so if Hou wins, they will kind of go back to the Ma Ying-jeou's era, the interaction between the two sides through Arets and Seth and Mac and Tao, right? There will be the counterpart on each side. So the dialogue probably will resume. But for the DPP, because it's the one China principle, they're not supporting that. So there's nuances. There's like, okay, they adhere to the ROC constitution, but they don't support the 1992 consensus. Especially nowadays, they link that with Xi Jinping's roadmap to reunification and also the one country, two system, one China principle. So yeah, there's news but interestingly, it's a three-way race. So we have Ko Wen-je. And Ko Wen-je is kind of trying to. He recently published the op-ed on The Economist and saying that he's Taiwanese a third way. But yeah, so the third way. But whether he accepts the 1992 consensus is ambiguous. It's not clear yet. And whether he opposes Taiwan de jure independence, he hasn't publicly said that, even though he criticized Lai Ching-te's stance on that. So these all nuances all revolving around cross-strait, their policy toward cross-strait. Also, maybe later we can talk about the identity issue.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that. I think we're still trying to sort out Chun-Yi's mic, but I might come to you next, Michael. I mean, I guess to answer the question, we're going to go back into the local details shortly, but why does this matter to the outside world? I mean, are people in Washington and London and across Europe sort of paying attention, and why does it matter?
Well, I think the short answer is yes, they are paying attention. Why does it matter? Slightly different reasons, depending on whether you're in Washington or if you're in Europe. If you're in Washington, this is very much about the US's position in the Pacific ever since the end of the Second World War. And it's become of a higher profile in recent years because of the growing tensions between the US and China. And I think both the US and China see influence in Taiwan, shall we say, as a proxy for their wider influence. It matters to Europe not from a direct, not so much from a direct security perspective, but there are three, I would say, reasons why it should be important to Europe and why perhaps Europeans should pay it more attention. The first is we've seen since the pandemic just how important semiconductors are to everyday life. Chips, you know, they make cars work, they make fridges work, they make our Zoom meeting at the moment work. They are to this decade what oil was to the 70s and 80s. 90% of the most advanced chips in the world are made in Taiwan. So ideally, if you're sitting in Europe, you want to make sure that you can still get hold of those. Secondly, there's an awful lot of trade passes through the Taiwan Strait. So again, if there is friction in the Taiwan Strait, that affects European commerce, European prosperity. And a third very simple reason is that regular surveys by all sorts of think tanks, analysts, the media, consistently highlight Taiwan as being the most liberal democracy in East Asia, I would say in the whole of Asia, threatened, shall we say, by a very illiberal neighbor. And European politicians regularly pay lip service to the importance of values. Well, if supporting values means anything, it's as important in Taiwan as it is in defending Ukraine. If I could just add very briefly to what Bo Jun was saying about the nuances. I mean, I very much agree with that. You find that whichever party, and I don't think the TPP would be different to this, but you find whoever is in power, be it the KMT, be it the DPP, the substance of their China policy differs little. What Taiwanese politicians have found, however, and whether this is good or bad, it's not for me to say, but they feel that it is to their own advantage in election campaigns to play up the differences with the other parties in terms of the China policy. I suspect that the great majority of Taiwanese voters would actually far prefer to see the election fought on domestic issues, but the politicians feel, no, actually we should fight it on this issue. What I think has actually changed significantly is that since Xi Jinping came into office, the Chinese have taken a much tougher line on dialogue. Prior to the current incumbent, we had a KMT president, Ma Ying-jeou. Prior to Ma Ying-jeou, we also had a DPP president, Chen Shui-bian, who was far more radical and caused an awful lot more concern, shall we say, in Washington and in Europe about his cross-straits policy. But even under Chen Shui-bian, there was actually a very strong, albeit discreet, two-way dialogue going on across the straits. Under Xi Jinping, the Chinese unilaterally decided they would put a stop to that dialogue unless Tsai Ing-wen effectively signed up to their preconditions.
Great, thanks, Michael. Chunyi, can you hear us now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, great. We can hear you. So I'm really glad that we've managed to sort that out. Thanks for doing that.
Apologize.
Chunyi, that's okay, no problem. I might come to you next then to kind of get a perspective on how is Beijing seeing the elections. And when we often hear that, you know, building on what Michael was saying, that the Chinese Communist Party, you know, has a lot of distrust for the DPP in general, but maybe sort of learned to understand Tsai Ing-wen somewhat, but they seem to have sort of particular sort of fear or animosity towards Lai Ching-te. What's your sense in how Beijing is seeing and feeling about this election?
Thank you, Ben, and thanks for all your patience. In that sense, I would say that actually Beijing has, comparing to Lai Ching-te, probably the CCP has a little bit more trust on Tsai Ing-wen, because Tsai has been, of course, she is a DPP candidate and she is a DPP leader. However, she has been really median in a sense of rather not to cross the Beijing's red line. Comparing with Tsai, actually Lai has a little bit sending of the danger signals, because Lai has been clearly or explicitly to support Taiwan's independence in the past. And to that, it's more intolerant to the Beijing government. Whereas if we look at Tsai, in her 8 years in government, Beijing wasn't happy, but however, Tsai has always been really keep her line to be in the medians rather than to be too extreme. So it's not happy, but acceptable choice, I would say, to Beijing. With Lai coming into the government, Beijing has more of unpredicted expectation that they wouldn't know what would really happen with Lai. However, there's another important variable we need to take into consideration, which Beijing just showed in his first slide to say Beijing Xiao, who is really a very good and capable communicator, not just with, well, I wouldn't say with Beijing, but more of the communicator with the US. And I think that we would need to take into the US role or their influence or their expectation, if you like, into this US Taiwan-China situation in terms of the election results. So I would say, although Beijing, of course, they don't like Lai Ching-te and they dislike Lai Ching-te even more than the current President Tsai Ing-wen, but they have more of a disbelief or distrust of Beijing Xiao in that sense, because Beijing Xiao has really good, smooth relationship with the US government. And I think that probably put Lai Xiao match in a really worse situation to the Beijing's expectation.
And I know that Lai Ching-te said the other day that there'd been unprecedented interference in the elections from China, and he was talking about the kind of military intimidation, aircraft flying around Taiwan, about propaganda and information and sort of hybrid warfare. I mean, what's your sort of independent view on that? Has it been as bad as he says, and also what has been the impact of that on the Taiwanese electorate?
Thank you, Ben. And it just coincidentally that it happened yesterday. All Taiwanese people received a alert, which is a national level alert from Ministry of Defense to say there is, in English, there is a missile across southern part of Taiwan, and for people to be alert. But actually in Chinese, it should be there is a satellite cross Chinese launch, China launched a satellite and cross the southern part of Taiwan. Probably people should be aware of. So it was sent from the Ministry of Defense, Taiwanese government. I would say actually, of course, it is probably a mistake. The system hasn't updated, but it's also to indicate that the Chinese influence or Chinese impact is ominous in this election, even to the extent that Ministry of Defense would be panicked in a sense to send out these national level alerts to all Taiwanese people 3 days before election. It was yesterday afternoon, 3 p.m. So of course, China's impact on Taiwan is everywhere. And as Lai said, that is not just missile, but also all the perspective of the satellite launch, if you like. But I would say there are more influence or Chinese impact, which we would not see, but there's there, which is a cyber attack as well, the misinformation, which I think Taiwan has been suffered a lot, although Taiwan has built the resilience to counter Chinese misinformation, but has been suffered a lot of all those misinformation. That's one. And the second thing is, I would say China has been also trying to bind off a lot of legislative candidates. So far, we have focused on the presidential results or presidential candidate, presidential elections. There's a lot to be seen on the legislative election as well, which would happen in the same day. And China has been buying off attempt to buy a lot of the legislative candidates. As far as I can see, they were, of course, KMT candidates were being alleged to be corrupt or bought off by the Chinese, or they are also TPP legislative candidates was bought off or alleged to be bought off. So I think that, of course, we've seen the presidential election probably quite fixed, but there's a lot of uncertainties in terms of legislative election, which has wider or more extensive of the Chinese influence there.
Thanks, Junyi. And I might come to you for a slightly different perspective on this, Bo-jun, because I guess over the last 20 or 30 years, broadly speaking, CCP propaganda efforts towards Taiwan have not been very effective, right? If you look at how Taiwanese people feel about whether or not they want to be part of the PRC, how they feel about their identity. But what's your sense in this election campaign? Have any, putting aside the kind of military intimidation, have these kind of information campaigns had positive impact from a CCP perspective? Have they, helped to kind of maybe advance the KMT cause or advance the kind of views that the CCP wants to see in Taiwan?
Thank you, Ben. Sorry, it took me a while to mute myself. Well, I've been in Taiwan for about a month, and I've observed that several NGOs or private sector organization, they are tracking the misinformation or disinformation campaign activities potentially coming from the mainland China, right? But attribution is always a tricky thing. I mean, it's very difficult to say who's behind or who are behind those misinformation line messages or social media messages, TikTok, but and other social media platforms, Facebook. So it's very difficult to track the source. But I know, I mean, this time on the ground, I think, well, interference has been always there, as we know, like cyber attack or misinformation campaign, or as you said, the military-wise, the gray zone tactics, right? All in recent days, we saw the balloons flying over Taiwan into Taiwan's ADIZ, and also some of them actually flying over the island, the main island of Taiwan. So these are all the Chinese strategy and part of their strategy to influence Taiwanese voters' decision to vote, because they main rhetoric is that, okay, if you vote for the ruling party, it's a vote for war. So they try to influence that way. But I mean, and yeah, you mentioned about this, whether this be successful. I don't really think so, because I do have a trust in Taiwan's democracy. A democratic system is that we've been democratized for decades, right, and for a while, and I do think it's maturing, and so it's somehow it's kind of counterproductive for, if you are from the Beijing perspective, is that they're not winning hearts and minds of the Taiwanese people, and so it's not actually working toward their favor. If we want to say, okay, you look at the poll about, not the poll about the election, but the polling about the identity, affiliation, right? Previously, some people, it's okay to say, oh yeah, you're both Taiwanese and Chinese ethnically. Ethnically, I think most people think, okay, that's fine, like Chinese culture. But when you identify yourself as Taiwanese, both Taiwanese or Chinese, that, I mean, more people identify themselves as solely Taiwanese. So from that perspective, it's not working towards Beijing's favor, right? We talk about we're sharing the same blood, and we have the descendants of the Yellow Emperor. Yeah, there's that kind of rhetoric. So yeah, I do think that but anyway, my conclusion is that there's always misinformation, disinformation campaign. And but Taiwan is an open society, so it's open to all kinds of information. You just have to improve or increase the level of media literacy, and that's something that I think has a bipartisan consensus. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and I think it's probably showing through across all the elections at the moment. That sort of people talk endlessly about the risk of mis and disinformation, but it's not new, and also social media and a much more kind of fractured public discourse is not going anywhere, and there's no rule or regulation that can kind of put the genie back in the bottle. So yeah, I think you're right. It's something we all need to learn to live with. Chunyi, you wanted to add something here.
But just a note to say that actually Taiwan has been, as I said, like being resilient in terms of the disinformation, misinformation. And if you notice, actually, like DPP's their by large nomination of legislator, the number one nominated by large legislator is a Professor Ko Wen-je. He is very famous in terms of counter disinformation, misinformation, which also showed the potential of the governing governments, they would see that this is important, and they would take into the consideration to tackle it. And I probably would say that because of all this bomb of Chinese disinformation or misinformation, there are quite a lot of the civil society also working against that. Taiwan might be able to share some successful experience because misinformation are globally phenomenon. Every country, every democracy suffered. So maybe that's also Taiwan's future soft power in that sense.
Yeah, thanks, Junyi. And I mean, on that point, Michael, I might come to you because I think a lot of Taiwanese politicians say, and people outside, that Taiwan is on the sort of front line of this global battle for democracy. But do you think there's actually anything that the UK, Europe, the US can learn about China from Taiwan's experience, or is it really quite a different case, given the history and the tensions between Taiwan and China?
I mean, it is a very different case, as you say, for the historic reasons, but that doesn't mean that Western politicians can't learn from it. Clearly, in recent years in the UK, but US too, and to a large extent Europe, there has been the development of a much more hawkish attitude towards China. But prior to that, certainly I think a lot of Western politicians were rather starry-eyed about China and frankly very naive about China. You might argue it's perhaps the pendulum's swung a bit too far the other way at the moment. I think the main area in which they could potentially learn from Taiwanese experience is in what we've been talking about, the whole sort of misinformation campaigns, which in Taiwan, frankly, have been pretty heavy-handed for very many years. But part of the reason for that is that we have to remember that the Chinese leadership is sending its message to its own domestic audience, first and foremost, and it needs to show its own domestic, not electorate, but public opinion, that it is taking a hard line on Taiwan. But having said that, the Chinese have spent considerable amounts of money on trying to buy influence in Taiwan, and that's something which I think we're only waking up to now in Europe, the extent to which they have been doing the same sort of thing here. I mean, in the UK, we've had a case highlighted. There's been a very recent case highlighted in Belgium. So we should at least perhaps be comparing notes with Taiwan as to how they've handled it. Although I would say that actually the Taiwanese have had difficulty handling it for reasons that both Bo-jun and Chun-yi have mentioned. I think particularly with its authoritarian past, Taiwan is very, very sensitive and cautious about trying to take too hard a line on freedom of the press and this sort of thing, which actually makes it easier for China to try to manipulate public opinion.
Thanks, Michael. And Bo-jun, I might just come to you for a flavor of how people are feeling on the ground. I mean, we know that typically Taiwan has really high election turnouts, much higher than in many established Western democracies. Yeah, are people being excited about this election? And also, what issues are people interested in? Because from the outside, we often talk about China and the US and cross-straits issues. That's been a big feature of the kind of debates between the candidates. But yeah, what about voters on the ground? What are they sort of most concerned about?
Well, thank you, Ben. And also, thank you, Junyi and Michael, for sharing their views on, and I agree with them. I think for your question, on the ground, it's been, I mean, walking on the street, people don't talk about politics, but because it's quite sensitive. People have different views and probably will end up in an argument. But I think from TV news programs, and also very vibrant. You see the rallies are full of people, and it's good that kind of passing, like post-COVID sceneries that people are not afraid of going out to rallies, and so which I think it's a good thing. It's people participate in the rallies and willing to show to voice out their views. So it's good. And regarding a turnout, it just I mean, yeah, usually it's been there's always high turnout for Taiwanese elections, and this time we have about close to 20 million voters, and among them there will be among us actually one of those voters would be 1 million new first-time voters. Because voting age in Taiwan is 20, right? So we'll see if, yeah, and young voters, I mean, based on the previous data, it seems like Ko Wen-je is quite popular among the young voters. So we'll see if that would be a game changer. But yeah, as you kind of related to that, what is that domestic issues? Because I think young people care more about domestic issues like very high pricey housing is an issue. So people talk about housing justice a lot on the campaign trail this time, and other issues such as energy transition. There's a debate about nuclear power and also the wind farm and the renewable energy, and education, cost of living, housing rights, as I mentioned, and elderly care. Taiwan is it's aging society, become maybe to some extent like an age society already. So these are all the social issues that people are talking about, and the presidential and vice presidential candidates, they are debating on the televised policy presentation and debate. So I just want to share one more thing is that I think in particular young voters, they I think they typically don't have strong party affiliations, and so arguably they care more about who can offer solution to the longstanding issues like low wages compared to other countries in the region, and as we discussed, the high housing prices in Taipei is so difficult to buy. It's almost impossible if you have like a salary job, you can buy a house. It's very, very difficult, and so these issues, I mean, the problems which have not significantly improved over the past either DPP or KMT's administration. So this could be one of the main reasons that TPP as a third way, as he branded himself, has been popular among young population, and who hope that this kind of like him, like non-traditional politician can come up with some new strategy or policy to improve their lives. So I guess that's the key factor in this election.
Great. Thanks, Bajun. And Chun-Yi, I mean, in terms of this election, I mean, I think it's the 8th presidential election that Taiwan has had. Is this the most unpredictable one so far, with a kind of three-horse race and, you know, only a very narrow sort of margin of lead before polling stopped 10 days before the election? So is this the most unpredictable race in recent history for Taiwan?
Thank you, Ben. I think the unpredictable factor would be the three-horse race. That is true. I think Taiwan hasn't been seeing a significant third party rising. And this is the presidential election that we've seen. TPP is the third party. But I also align with what Bojun said, that TPP is more of attracting the young voters. And but so far, I still think that it's predictable of the result in that sense. But it's very exciting to see there will be a third party. I think as an observer scholar, we always wanted to see there would be more of the challenging of the existing party, because that is healthy for democracy. So with the new voice, TPP, to join in, I think that is good. It's also just to say that I think for the reason that whether we can predict or not is to see whether we will be able to see the voters to get what they want. I think for more majority, if I could say, although I'm not based in Taiwan, but I can say that the majority of the Taiwanese people still care most of the democracy, the sovereignty that Taiwan has. Therefore, even though China has already intimidated not just missile or disinformation, but economic sanction, if you like China has already said that if DPP, Lai Ching-te Xiao Meiqing would win, they will cut off the ECFA, which is a semi-free trade agreement with Taiwan. That it would be impact on the economic development or output or the young people's working opportunities. However, even so, Taiwanese voters, I would say, think still probably draw more into defense democracies that have been strived for so long that Taiwan deserved. So it is unpredictable and predictable. I think I haven't really answered your question, Ben, but I provide what I observed, and I think that it's probably would be the case. Yeah.
Thanks, Shinji. And before I get to questions from the audience, Michael, I might just come to you on sort of what happens the day after. I mean, especially when it comes to China's sort of attitude towards Taiwan and the increasing pressures that we've already spoken about. I mean, do you see that pressure relenting under any of the potential candidates as president?
Well, in the short, let's assume, just for the sake of debating or discussing your question, let's assume that the KMT wins the election. Then in the short term, I think undoubtedly the atmospherics, the optics will improve. Chun-Yi mentioned that China has threatened to suspend the trade agreement. They won't do that if the KMT wins. In fact, they may well then move on to sign a further agreement on trade and services. But the fundamental issue is that ultimately China wants to take back or take control of Taiwan. They call it reunification. The Taiwanese would say unification because it's never really been part of China. And whereas prior to Xi Jinping, Chinese leaders were always content to sort of just play this long, bide our time is on our side, don't rush it. Xi Jinping is much less patient. And it's pretty clear that whoever wins, let's assume the KMT wins, they will then be under pressure after the honeymoon period to start moving towards some sort of political agreement with China. And the fundamental problem that China is unwilling to face up to is that the Taiwanese electorate as a whole, bar a tiny majority, do not want that. So whoever wins the election in Taiwan, the room for maneuver, if you like, is actually quite constrained, and is too constrained to meet the expectations of the CCP under Xi Jinping. That's the fundamental issue. So as I say, short term, I mean, certainly, as I think Chun-Yi said much earlier, if Lai Ching-te wins, and the last polls we saw suggested he had a narrow lead, then we might well see China in a fit of sort of spite, take some sort of retaliatory measures, might insist there has to be compromises. I would also think it very likely that, not straight away, but before the inauguration in, I think, May, China will just try to test, provoke the new Taiwanese leader with some sort of action in the Straits just to see how they respond. So that will be the worrying period if the DPP wins. But as I say, fundamentally, at the end of the day, the objectives of the two sides of the Straits are incompatible.
Yeah, thanks for setting out that clear but quite depressing picture, Michael.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, that's okay. It's good to say it as it is. We've had a couple of questions from our audience about the legislative elections. And I guess, yeah, the polls are sort of forecasting that the DPP may lose control. I guess, yeah, it seems quite likely one way or another, the president may not, have their party may not have control of the legislative yuan. Bo-jun, what do you think that would mean if that does turn out to be the case, for the next 4-year term, if you have a kind of hung parliament effectively or a president representing a different party from that which controls the legislature? What does that mean for Taiwan's politics and stability?
Right, thank you for the question. Yeah, that's a very important one because it seems like we're on track to have a hung parliament, and TPP's as a third party probably will get some seats. And I mean, they already have 5 seats right now, so they probably will. I mean, if you consider the party list system, the party probably garner more seats this time. And you have the KMT will increase some seats by estimation, and but it seems like none of them will have more than 57, which is because total is 113 seats, right? Then if you want to be a majority party, it's you have to win more than 57 seats. And it doesn't look like anybody will will have the luxury of that. And so yes, and so in the future, I guess for the new government, if it's TPP, will face a opposition parties in the parliament, and probably will challenge a lot, challenge TPP's policies a lot through the legislative branch. If it's KMT, then Hou Yu-ih has said many times that he's still willing to form a coalition government with the Ko Wen-je. Although the 6-point consensus they signed previously fell apart, but it seems like it's still. I mean, the KMT is still willing to work with the white camp, and so there will be a blue-white coalition government. And well, if the Ko Wen-je wins, then then he still has to work with the KMT either in the parliament or in the government. So so 2 scenarios, right? TPP versus TPP government administration, Lai Ching-te's administration versus a parliament legislative yuan controlled by the KMT and the TPP, or the other way around. It's that's a likely scenario, and that would be for the first time. I think last time was during Chen Shui-bian's era. We had that parliament. So well, right now 2024. I don't know. Actually, I don't know what to expect with that. I think that would be very different with the previous, because I remember that time it was very intense, very tense, very they fought with each other a lot. They boycott each other. So I mean, yeah. So it was very divided country that time. So the new in the next, I mean, the president and the parliament, I think there will be a totally new thing. Yeah.
Great, thanks for that. Sticking with the domestic politics question, Chunyi, I might come to you on this. I mean, a few people have asked why, given that the candidates don't really differ that much on cross-strait policy, and given that voters are so upset about lots of economic issues, low wages, high housing prices, egg shortages and the rest, why haven't the candidates spent more time campaigning and fighting with each other over domestic policy? Why have they spent so much time talking about cross-strait questions rather than domestic economic policy, given that seems to matter more to voters?
Very good questions. I think we should actually advise the candidates to focus more on the domestic issues. And this is what I feel that in the presentation campaign or in their debates, it's really focused on their China policy rather than domestic issue, or the personal attack, whether there's corruption of rights from house or lands, rather than the actual domestic issues, which I think this has been the situation, unfortunately, of the presidential campaign, really just to look at the China factor rather, or the pitfall, personal attack on the corruption or the misbehavior, whatever, rather than look into the actual policy. I haven't really get the actual policy out from either of the parties' presidential candidates, apart from, I think, Lai in his presidential debates, he mentioned about the housing, he mentioned about to provide young people more working opportunities and energy in that sense. But apart from, I would like to hear more as well. So this is the point I would think that all the presidential candidates should focus on. But to answer the question why they don't, I would say this is because it's a really big elephant in the room for all the presidential candidates to look into China and to imagine how it would be as bleak as Michael just set out earlier, the consequence after they became the leader of Taiwan. But again, it doesn't really mean that is the way it should be. It should really focus on how the economy should reform, how should the government looking into the increasing the wage and also the high inflation. It's unfortunately not really yet to be well debated or well explained of their policies.
Thanks, Chun-yi. Michael, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, just to say, I mean, I agree with Chun-yi. The cynic that I am says that part of the reason is it's much easier for the politicians to talk about China because they know that actually there's not much they can do about it at the end of the day. Whereas if they talk too much about domestic issues, there's a real worry that they will be held to account on them, which is something that few politicians want to go down that road. And another factor, memories are short, but not that short. The last presidential election 4 years ago, China really helped Tsai Ing-wen enormously with its behavior in Hong Kong. Prior to the actions it took there, the KMT was very confident it was going to win the election. Basically, China lost it for them. And I think since then, the politicians certainly feel, look, China, our position on China can make a difference. Let's focus on that.
Thanks, Michael. And if people are interested in what Taiwanese politics would look like without talking about cross straits, it's worth watching a series called Wave Makers on a leading streaming service, which is quite fun. And I think there's no mention of China basically in the whole thing, or the US. But it's pretty interesting, and weirdly, one of the actresses did up briefly as a vice presidential candidate in sort of classic art imitates life. So yeah, that's definitely a good watch, I think. We have a question from Daniela Galperovich of Voice of America. I might direct this to you, Bojun, about Chinese propaganda. And do you see any similarities between China's propaganda to Taiwan and Russia's propaganda towards Ukraine?
Well, thank you. Oh, that's a very important question. Well, but to be honest, I'm not the expert on this. I mean, regarding Russia and Ukraine relation, also like about their approach towards Russia. So I cannot draw any similarity with that. But sorry, can you hear me? Yeah, because I think my AirPods is the battery is run. But anyway, yeah. So regarding that, maybe I'll leave Chun-yi or
okay,
or
fine.
Michael
Yeah, Chun-yi wants to come in.
Can I just add one more? Sorry, I think my previous question I didn't answer well, but I just want to add one more thing. Is that I think either for the KMT or the blue-white for the KMT government or the TPP government or even the TPP's government, it would be very difficult for them to push forward their policy. Also, the budget plan for the TPP, the budget plan will be checked as by the parliament. So it'll be very different than the past 8 years, because past 8 years they control the parliament as well as the legislative and so it's very easy to kind of like to have budget plan and also spend money to have some project going on. But for the KMT government, it'll be super difficult to promote anything related to China. So the kind of whether they want to start negotiating more agreement again with China, because during Ma Ying-jeou's era, both sides signed like 23 agreements, right? And for the future KMT or TPP government, they both want to have this supervisory act. Very difficult for them to push forward for that. Anyway.
Okay, thanks, Bojun. And Chun-yi?
Yeah, just to say that with Ma Ying-jeou's government of that passing the bill, and then let's result into the sunflower movement. So they learned the lesson. They wouldn't do that. But answer the question, I would just to help out in that sense that I think the propaganda China is using now to Taiwan is different from what Russia is using to Ukraine. I think I would say, again, I'm not exactly expert of Russian-Ukraine relations, but I'm working on a paper to compare of China, Taiwan, Russia, Ukraine with real Russia experts of my colleagues. But from what I can observe is the Russia's campaign to Ukraine was more on the culture and come back to the nation. It's kind of campaign, correct me if I'm wrong, but China knew that has not attracted Taiwanese voter. It probably was a strategy 30 years ago when Deng Xiaoping, well, 50 years ago, 1979, when Deng Xiaoping published that letter to Taiwanese compatriots to welcome you back to motherland. That strategy has not worked out or end up very badly on Taiwan. So I think China's strategy or propaganda to Taiwan is very different from Russia to Ukraine.
Thanks, Chinyi. Michael, I might come to you with the next question about Korea and Japan, because yeah, we've talked a lot about US and China, but we've got to remember that Japan is one of the closest neighbors. I think the island of Yonaguni is just what, 70 odd miles off Taiwan. And when those sort of Chinese missiles were fired over Taiwan after the Pelosi visit, I think some of them ended up in Japan's exclusive economic zone. So what's Japan in particular, and maybe Korea, if you had anything to add, thinking about these elections?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question, and Japan's relations are very often overlooked, and yet actually they are critical, as you've just pointed out. Taiwan is far more critical to the defense and security of Japan than it is to that of the USA. So Japan's got a very big vested interest in this. It tends to behave much more discreetly in its relations than, say, the US does. But it's always been the case that Japan feels much more comfortable with the DPP administration in Taipei than it does with the KMT administration. That's partly the whole history of China-Taiwan relations, going back sort of over 2 centuries or so now. So I think, and just as an example, after Tsai Ing-wen won the election back in 8 years ago, 2016, but before she took office, she visited Japan. She had a private meeting with the then Japanese Prime Minister Abe, but this was kept discreet and quiet and so on. So I think you can be confident that if Lai Ching-te wins on Saturday, the Japanese will be pleased, will be relieved. If the KMT wins, then they will be more concerned, but they will take a cautious position to see how it actually plays out. Korea is a very good question. I mean, Korea was one of the last big countries to switch diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to China. It only did so in about 1992. Partly because it was so late, partly because of the history of the relationship beforehand, and partly because of the way the relationship was abruptly broken. A lot of bitterness was created in Taiwan about the switch in a way that didn't happen, for example, when South Africa switched relations a few years later. And there's still a little bit of background to that. Korea is also very, very, or attaches great importance, I should say, to its relations with China. It is very, very wary about doing anything to upset those relations with China. So it tends to stay very quiet indeed on relations with Taiwan. I think given the way things are going, they may feel they will at one stage, sooner or later, may have to take a choice. But I think they will be privately pleased if the KMT win, because from their perspective, that would mean, in the short term, at least a more stable relationship between Taiwan and China that helps them in terms of just access to the straits for commerce and trade and so on. But it won't be a big difference. It's much less critical for them than it is for Japan.
Thanks so much, Michael. And with that, we are out of time for today, but I just want to thank everyone for joining us in our audience, and also thank again Michael, Bojun, and Chunyi. This is, as I said at the start, a year of many, many elections. In the next few weeks, we're going to have events upcoming on Pakistan elections, if they go ahead, and the Indonesian elections, and many more too. So keep an eye on our website. But thanks again to our speakers. Thanks everyone for joining us, and see you all again soon. Thanks.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, everyone.